Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. My name is James Hale. I'm with Downbeat Magazine and also SoundStageExperience.com, which actually is based here in Ottawa. And I'm so happy to be here with everybody today, especially these panelists, because we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to everybody here, I think, and that's the changing environment that all of us, whether we're bookers or musicians or writers like me, we all have to deal with this changing environment, so we need to try to figure it out for ourselves. So let me introduce our panel today. Starting at the far left, Ernesto Cervini is a Toronto-based drummer with a performance degree in both piano and clarinet from the Royal Conservatory of Music. He has no talent at all. It's sad, eh? Ernesto also has he has more degrees from the University of Toronto and the Manhattan School of Music. And during his time in New York City, he was a frequent performer at the city's top jazz clubs. Today, he's on the U of T faculty, and he's also Canada's preeminent jazz publicist. And I also have to apologize today because I'm gonna blow so many European friends' names today. But anyway, Danielle Oosterop. She opened her booking agency in 2011. Since then, she's been working with the cream of Scandinavia's improvising artists, including Mats Gustafsson, Pal Nilsson Love, Firefire Orchestra, Atomic, and she books tours mostly in Europe, but obviously also here in Canada, the US, and South America. Peter Robb is a native Ottawan who's built a successful journalism career here in his hometown. At the Ottawa Citizen, he held a wide range of editorial jobs, culminating in his tenure as the newspaper's arts editor. He's also got a background in arts administration, primarily with the Great Canadian Theatre Company here in Ottawa, and today he's one of the forces behind the thing when it arrives in my mailbox on a Sunday morning. And I'm sure everybody in this room knows Peter Hum, but if you don't, you should know that he currently holds two of the best jobs in North American journalism. He's both the food and the jazz critic for the Ottawa Citizen. And if that wasn't enough, he's also a superb pianist with 3 albums under his name, including a brand new one. And whether you're a fan of journalism, his music, or both, we're really fortunate that he decided to return to his hometown and make his career here. People are always astounded whenever I travel that Ottawa has Peter and myself and John Kelman, who also is widely published. And they ask, wow, I mean, you must have a vital music scene, jazz scene in Ottawa. So we just nod and say, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we're going to open things with a question that hopefully will get us going down a couple of avenues. Just a little bit of a anecdote from my past. In the mid-'90s, I was working as a speechwriter in telecommunications business here in Ottawa in Canada, and writing speeches for a couple of the chief executive officers at Bell Canada and what then was called Stentor, which was the national network of telecommunications companies. And the CEO got an offer to speak at Canada Music Week about how technology, remember this is the mid-'90s, was going to change music. And well, the great thing about the job as the speechwriter for the CEO was you got carte blanche to go and talk to basically anybody you wanted to, because you just said the CEO's name and it opened a lot of doors. And so I talked to a lot of very, very smart engineers about what they thought the technology was going to do for music. And it's remarkable how far off the mark they were. But 2020 also is probably what we can say is the 25th anniversary of the turning point for the digital revolution in music. Napster was still 3 years away, but it had become obvious that the way music reached people was going to change. The first MP3 player, the WinPlay 3, anybody have one of those? The WinPlay 3 was released on September 9th, 1995. A new form of media, the CD-RW, was being readied for widespread release, and nothing would ever be the same. So 25 years later, the bedrock question is, where are we in this digital revolution or evolution? Are we there yet? Where is there? Is there a there? And are we, artists, audiences, and all the other components of the music community destined to deal with continual change? Or is there a new stable business model that we can rely on and use as a new foundation that we can build on? And I'm going to turn to my long-term friend Peter to kick that off.
The analog. Technology sucks. Oh, no, okay. There we go. Some excellent people to speak after. And I'm going to apologize in advance because I come at this, as James may have implied, sort of from two fronts, which is to say that I've been writing about music, amongst other things, for, well, about 25 years, or maybe even a little longer at the Ottawa Citizen in town. So on one hand, I'm kind of in this big musical community, I'm one of those guys that's blessed and gets like music given to me. It just sort of falls from the sky and arrives in, my mail hutch and, now in my email. So on one hand, I'm that, but as James says, I also do music as well, make CDs, play gigs. So on the other hand, I'm kind of the neurotic individual who complains that other people like me, aren't listening enough to my music, aren't writing about my music, aren't doing these kinds of things. So you may hear me speak from either of those persona when I do speak, but I'll try to be more the journalist at this point. So I've been at the paper for 30 years, and for more than 25, music has been, and jazz in particular, has been one of my beats. And to be frank, if I didn't cover jazz, they would probably be okay with that, especially when there's not a festival that's kind of the driving news force that it is. But that's just to say that within the context of the mainstream media, other things are priorities, like food, which I also write about as a priority. And if I write about hamburgers, that's going to get 25,000 hits and 200 comments. But if I write about John Coltrane, John Coltrane is not as significant to most people as like burger joints. So on that depressing thought, what I wanted to offer to you just in response to James's question is that we're 25 years in, but I feel like we are still in the thick of it. I'll only offer kind of one measure, such as it is, and a couple of analogies drawn from the beleaguered place where I work. So in the 90s, let's just say, I mentioned getting free music. I was getting CDs, at a tumultuous rate. Like let's say I would get 500 CDs to review in a year, and of them, I'd review some fraction of that, because basically I had to squeeze it in and kind of sneak it in, because, what mainstream media person is going to write or pay somebody to review jazz CDs 5 days a week? So I would get 500 CDs. But now, given the way things are, as we've moved from hard copy to digital, I probably get, less than 200. But meanwhile, the digital side has expanded to, more than, so like it may be more than 500 titles or 600, but it's going to be downloading links and streaming. And I have Ernesto to thank for a lot of that. I have much to thank Ernesto for, actually. But that's just one measure, but I think it says something. We haven't gone all the way. Hard copy still exists, of course, and it's still something that Ernesto and myself and Cody, other people are trying to monetize, like desperately so. But so what I'd also offer, hopefully pretty quickly, as analogies for what's going on the music side is stuff that comes from the newspaper, old media side of things, which Peter, my former boss, can also speak to. So, one analogy that I heard from a certain newspaper executive was that for a newspaper company to make the transition from a hard copy company to an online information provider, it's kind of like trying to change the tires of your car while the car is driving down the highway, like at 120 miles per hour, kilometers per hour. And maybe that's one way of thinking of the challenge that music is facing. I mean, you're trying to do these two things simultaneously. And then the other thing that also seems to resonate for me as an analogy is that that same newspaper executive, I think, told me or told us in a presentation some time ago, was that it was just kind of unforeseeable for newspapers in, I'm not sure what the right year would be, but, you know, let's say 10 years ago or 8 years ago, that they would have imagined that there's this revenue pie, like a pie chart, and there would be so much money on the table for media to get. And then all of a sudden, Facebook and Google would come and take 75% of the pie, leaving us a quarter of the pie, old media, to fight for that. And that is kind of like driving the shedding of jobs and the shuttering of papers and whatnot. So that's the digital disruption on old media. So to my way of thinking, you know, maybe it's possible that you know, YouTube and Spotify and streaming services are to music as Facebook and Google are to old media. That these are the big technological disruptors, and on one hand we view them as opportunities. I mean, we're still trying to hitch the wagons of old media to Facebook and propagate our stories through them. And you know, we really hope that Google is going to, the searches are going to drive people to newspapers. And you know, we hope that Spotify is going to give musicians exposure, and likewise YouTube. But the money's just not there, right? For someone else is getting rich. Anyway.
No, I was going to actually jump to Daniela, because you come at things from a very different perspective. One, from being in Europe, and secondly, as someone who represents artists and presents them to bookers to share with audiences. What are the changes you see in the business model, and just sort of your overall view of the changing landscape? What are the challenges and changes you've seen? View of the changing landscape. What are the challenges and changes you've seen?
Well, there are different aspects. One of the aspects, if we talk about making money from what used to be records, CDs, I'm personally not really involved in that, but I did a little survey under the musicians I work with, and it's, you know, it's sort of a niche. So people never really got rich from selling CDs or LPs. That never really happened. I worked independently for 10 years, but I started 20 years ago. Yeah, so I don't think there's a huge change in that. All the musicians I work with, they still sell physical CDs and LPs, especially at concerts. So I guess that's where I come in, because I'm the one who tries to get them gigs. And CD sales really can help to make a tour worthwhile. But yeah, I think, you know, the whole digital, of course, the people who only listen to Spotify, that might be the future, but we also should, you know, enjoy the present while it lasts, because people still, not everybody does that, and you know, people our age, I don't know, I can't really see in the dark, but I don't think there's some super young people here. They still like those media, so that still exists. Yeah, and as for my work, but that might be a topic we can talk about later. Mm-hmm. Of course, for me, it's very different. When I started, I would send out CDs to presenters, and now I send out an email with links to listen to. Right. That makes my life much easier, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ernesto, I mean, you work on two sides, actually three sides you had in your academic career, but as a musician and as a publicist, is it easier or harder these days to connect your artists or your own artistry with an audience, and also the returns. I was telling Peter, I saw an interesting stat just before I left home this morning, that Warner Music was celebrating the fact that that streaming was up 37% in the last quarter, and I was thinking, oh, gee, musicians are going to get 37% more revenue now, but.
Not true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's interesting because you said this all started about 25 years ago. And so for me, this is all I've really known. Like when I was in university, iPods became a thing. And when I was in high school, I started burning CDs. So this is all, I've grown up in this world already. And I mean, as well as I'm sure a lot of my colleagues, lament the fact, like the old days when you could make a CD and actually sell them more. But I think the idea now is that you just have to go with what's happening. And so, the fact that Spotify is a thing and you can fight it, but you can only fight it for so long. There's so many people who are consuming music that way that to, put your flag in the ground and be like, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't know if it's so effective in terms of you getting your music out there. I don't choose to listen to music using Spotify. If I like something, I buy it because I want to support artists because I am one. But I'm not about to, judge everybody else for how my music get out there to all these people. Teaching at U of T, and I also teach at Humber College. And when I talk to my students, anytime I mention any music, they just find it on Spotify right away. They're like, oh, what's that? Yeah, I'm going to add it to my playlist. And, for a couple of years, I was the dumb teacher that was like, how does Spotify, I don't understand how that works. And now I'm like, okay, I need to figure this out because even if I don't have to use it as a person, as a musician, I need to use it as a tool. And I think being ignorant to that is you're just not kind of moving with the times. And I think the question that we were talking about at the beginning about whether we're there or not, like whether we're done, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, and I think the idea of trying to think of what's going to happen in 5 years, I don't know if there's any point trying to think about it yet, because it moves so fast. And, I talk to my students about how I used to walk around with a Discman and listen to music when I was in university, and they think that's hilarious. And it wasn't that long ago. Like I'm not that old, and yet like a Discman isn't a thing anymore. So the idea of what's going to be happening in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I think you just have to do your best to stay with the present. And I can't say as a publicist, there are still a lot of people that want physical copy. I would say usually on a campaign I send out around 180 CDs, and my digital send out is around 150, maybe a little less. So I still send out more physical than I do digital.
That always surprises me.
Mm-hmm. But if you think about it, the people who are writing about jazz and are probably DJing jazz shows are probably not 30 and 40-year-olds, right? So they're people who appreciate having CDs. I'm not yet 40, but I still appreciate having CDs because when I was growing up, I bought CDs, and I loved going to HMV into the tiny jazz section and finding the new jazz CDs I wanted. So I still appreciate that, but I can understand how, my students who are 19 and they don't have a CD player because their computer doesn't have one because they don't make those anymore. And, the idea of like a CD player is kind of like, it's something your parents have, right? So they have no use for that. And the liner notes and all that stuff, they'll just be like, I can just find it. I can just Google it. So, anyways, I forget what your question was, but but I think the best thing, if I can speak about it from an artist point of view, is you just have to go with it, and you can't. I think if you fight it, it's a losing battle. So I think you just have to kind of just evolve as quickly as you can. It moves so fast that you just have to try it. And again, I find it's moving too fast for me. So I can only imagine someone who's, 20 years older and didn't kind of already grow up in that, how like frustrating it must be. But you kind of just have to like do your best. And to be honest, what I did is for my company, I hired someone to do our social media, and she's 20. So she gets it and she knows what she's doing. And so I just get her to do it all. Like, I don't understand how tagging and all this stuff. Did you do it?
He's not
'Cause
40 yet.
You're young and hip, and I can just be the old guy going, hey, how does this work again? But in this case, I totally feel like I am, because
Close to that.
because Spotify wasn't a thing, 5 years ago? It wasn't a thing yet? Or, I don't know. Right? And it's already, and now it's
Yeah,
so
I mean, the new,
huge.
no,
And so if you just weren't paying attention, then it passes you by.
yeah.
I just, sorry. No, I just want to add before I seem, and the musicians I've worked with seem very old-fashioned. We do both. We do both. We also try, of course, Spotify and all that. We still do that. I even had a Walkman
I had a
with
Walkman too,
cassettes. And now some of the people, they make
Peter, you
cassettes
wanted to-
again.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
very
okay.
hip
Everything old is
nowadays.
new.
So it always
Oh, I see.
revolves.
A few years ago, probably closer to 10 years ago now, I guess, not too far from here, backstage in Confederation Park. Just send yourself there on a beautiful sunny day for just a second. Okay. I was talking to Dave Douglas, and it was not to choose to go with the artist share model, which was really in the media right then, because Maria Schneider had just won a Grammy Award for her artist share record. It was the first time that an artist had won a Grammy Award for an album not on a major label and distributed, through crowdsourcing, as we call it now. It wasn't called that in those days. And I was kind of lamenting, the fact that people like the two Peters and I were kind of, struggling along, finding fewer and fewer outlets to publicize that music and write about it and critique it and give the context to audiences. And Dave said, well, you guys just have to be as innovative as musicians are. You have to come up with your own way to do this. So Peter, Robb, my question to you, as someone who has sort of broken out of the traditional model and created with some colleagues a digital format to dive really deeply into the arts here in Ottawa, what are your observations and learnings from what you're doing?
That it's a labor of love.
Your observations and learnings from what you're doing.
That it's a labor of love, mostly. Not that it's a labor of great wealth and income, or even particularly large impact. Although it's a long-term game in one way. In another way, it's immediate. You can publish a story immediately, and people will start picking it up. I wanted to come back to something that, and just this might sort of explain what's happened in the news business. When I started at the Citizen in 1987, there were roughly 200 people in our. Is the mic on? You hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'm not too far back. I was sort of leaning back and posing and smoking my cigar. The newsroom had 200 people in it, journalists, working journalists. That's editors, writers, etc. I think there might be 50 today, of which about 35 of them would be writers, actually going out and gathering content. In 1989, I believe, the Ottawa Citizen went into 200,000 homes on a Saturday, in a city of about 600,000 people, maybe. Wow. So that penetration was unbelievable, right? That's the whole city, really. Now it might be 45,000 homes on a Saturday, and that's the big paper, right? There's roughly 50,000 on its Facebook page. I think the likes, that's around the number. So, this has changed, right? I mean, that's a forest fire. And that's the media business in Canada. Very few newspapers, the Toronto Star, for example, is a newspaper that we never thought would ever see the kind of cratering that it's going through right now, and it is disastrous. So what's left? Well, what's left are the green shoots that come up after the forest fire. That's sort of how I view Arts File. The reason I do it is because I like the arts. I'm fascinated by it. You know, for me, being the arts editor was one of the great jobs I could have. When I was working in the theater business in the 80s, you know, it was something that was really enjoyable for me. Contact with music, etc. as the administrator. Interestingly enough, when I started at GCTC in 82, there were 3 theater companies. By 86, there was one left in Ottawa, apart from the National Arts Centre. So this kind of attrition has happened before and will continue to happen. What's different now is that media models cannot operate on what they used to operate on, which was advertising revenue. Peter said 75% for Facebook and Google is actually closer to 85% now, which means there's 15% left to be divided amongst all the rest of us. So what we need now to consider in the media is we're not going to make it on advertising. We're just not. So we're casting about for models, and unfortunately the larger media enterprises are dinosaurs or icebergs or whatever you want to call them. They're hard to change direction. They're sort of trapped in the success of their old model and they can't quite get rid of it. If they did get rid of it, they'd go broke, frankly. They still make a fair bit of enough money actually to employ those 50 people in the newsroom and all the other things that they do with it. But it's also an incredibly complex business. You know, a newspaper begins in the morning, they want to pay the overtime, and then they're published at about 9 o'clock that night. So this is a perpetual motion machine, right? It never stops. And then you have to feed the internet as well. So for me, for the other thing that the internet has brought is the ability to publish. It is easy. WordPress is a wonderful program. You can set up a site in a minute and you can start publishing, which is essentially what ArtsFile did. I left the Citizen in 2016 thinking I'd freelance for a while, you know, on what I like to do. Took a buyout with a whole bunch of people. 6 months later, Citizen stopped freelance, so I started ArtsFile. I hired 3 other refugees from the Citizen, and we're still going today. Our overhead's low. We have a functioning website, and we just carry on. There's enough tiny advertising. There's enough advertising to sustain it, and a publisher who's actually committed to journalism. And I don't know, I'm sort of halfway torn whether this is a vanity project for me or whether this is just something I like to do and I can't help myself. But we write long-form journalism of the kind that you used to see in the Citizen 15, 20 years ago. I believe that artists' stories are interesting, so I want to let them talk, right? The thing that I think the artist now needs to understand, that this is now a two-way street, not a one-way street. When I was the Citizen guy and I would interview you, that was fine, right? You got your bang, right? You were in a big paper going into a lot of homes. You're now in a small paper or in a small website, and you're not getting into so many homes, but you actually may have more of a network than I do. And yet the story I tell about you is useful for your network. So this is a dynamic and a synergistic relationship now. It's also an equal relationship now, right? I'm interested in you. You're interested in having your story told. So that's sort of the theory in my own mind. This is a very simplistic theory, and I know listen, everybody's different. Everybody approaches it in a different way. What I have discovered in this process is that I'm actually kind of like the musician or the visual artist or the writer. I don't make any money or very little money, but I do invest in what I'm creating, right? And that's an interesting thought bubble for me. So that operates on one level. The musician, the artist, the creator, the writer, the novelist, the PR person needs to think about the media landscape at that level. It needs to think about it at the Ottawa Citizen level. Hopefully for them, it needs to think about it at the CBC national news level, and it needs to think about the international world level, because it's surprising where your stuff goes, right? I think Peter's blog got him to a gig in South Africa one year. Huh? Okay. So you can be global and local and all these things, but you actually have to activate your brain around that. That's my take on it. Where it goes, well, I don't have any expectations about technology is going to change. I think the fundamental is, do you like what you do? Do you write well about what you do? Can you say to yourself that I'm doing the best I can to make good art, or I'm making a good story and an interesting interview? Those principles still seem to hold. So I would say find the people that you trust. This is the advice you get anyway. Find the people you trust, follow them, support them. And Ernesto was sort of saying the same thing, I think, and that, you know, musician to musician. I would say throw in the journalists in there who actually like the arts that they're writing about, who are interested in it, and you broaden your network. So that's sort of my thing.
Well, what Peter's made me think of with respect to this notion of you know, the business model for various actors in the music community is that well, certainly the notion of the arts being some kind of public good, as journalism might be some kind of public good, is worth pondering. And insofar as these things are public goods, then maybe the question is how they might be supported by publicly collected funds. So journalism has looked to the federal government for support.
Yes, that's available
Recently.
now. That surprisingly is now becoming available. I mean, there are models out there, eh?
Right, and of course the concrete example for this, if you'll bear with a bit of product placement, is the CD that I just put out. So, but
That's Ordinary Heroes.
yeah.
Ordinary
But
Heroes.
what I raised, I mean, this is
signing later.
no, this is of a piece to what we're talking about. It is connected, I think, as an example of you know, the plight or the opportunities that we're in the midst of. In that, I'm fortunate because I don't have to pay my mortgage with, you know, my musician's earnings. It's kind of on the top, and it's also, you know, a question of trying not to lose money doing this thing that I also love, right? But you know, this thing costs a certain amount of money to make, but fortunately I was able to get money from the City of Ottawa and from the Ontario Arts Council to do it. So, you know, thank you, taxpayers. And you know, I'm going to go out on tour in March, and I'm going to do that with help from the Ontario Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts. So you know, if these things, to the extent that these things were self-financed or, you know, paid for by labels in the past, as those, as the revenue that was available for musicians, or savings or bank accounts, as those things might have dwindled because Spotify's got your money now, and if labels aren't there, you know, with thankfully a few exceptions to bankroll things, then, you know, we fall back, I think, on the notion of public good to make sure that we can pursue our art. So now I'm wearing the artist's hat rather than the journalist's hat I was wearing a few minutes ago. We fall on that kind of support to do what we love and make these things real.
I think, well, I was just going to jump in and say the other aspect of this dynamic relationship, this two-way street, is the currency of the media now is eyeballs and clicks. It's the same for you guys, really, musicians. A lot of people are reluctant to like things on Facebook or whatever. Or they're reluctant about Facebook and all that. But Ernesto was making a good point that these are the things we have. They're kind of sinister, and they're flawed, and they're kind of evil, and we're stuck with them. But I do think there are positive results from activating a choice, right? You can make a choice to like something, and that's going to help whoever. I think it's like the informed reader, you know, the informed consumer. That's where we're at now, and everybody sort of has to be that way and understand that there is interest and there's a gain to be made by engaging and supporting. And I think that works for artists, and that works now, I think, for journalists too. And will increasingly. Large media entities, I think, are sort of heading the way the labels have gone, and they're not there yet, and they're a little slower to do it. But a lot of record labels are basically management hubs. They'll print your press release for you, but in the old days where they wouldn't put you in the studio for 2.5 weeks and let you do all the drugs you want and then record your song, They don't do that. You do that. That's the musician as business person. So, same thing. I don't know if it's quite there at the Citizen, but there's a lot of freelancers out there who are keen to talk to you.
Daniela, I wanted to turn to you to pick up from Peter Hum's point because, again, you come at things from the European perspective, and particularly in Northern Europe. I mean, I remember talking to Mats Gustafsson a number of years ago about the kind of support that he and other artists in Sweden were getting. Maybe talk a bit, because I think the European model has kind of been what Canada, at least, I think to a much lesser extent the United States, but we have sort of used that model here. Where do things sit in terms of that kind of state-funded support for the arts, specifically improvising artists now? How do you see it going, and how do you see it evolving, along with the changing overall digital environment?
Well, I don't think there's such a thing as a European model. It's very different. Every country is very different. When you spoke to Mats a few years ago, things were good in Sweden. And now it's gotten worse. There's less money for support from Sweden. Norway is still very good. Norway's got a lot of oil. They do support their artists, so we can use that money to travel. Not so much to produce CDs, I don't think, although maybe sometimes also. And other countries, it really depends. It depends on what government there is, of course, as always. In the Netherlands, we had a big cutback. That's already 8 years ago, a long time ago. In Belgium, they did it just now, just 2 months ago. They cut subsidy funding by 60% on some project funding. So yeah, it's going up. I was to say up and down. It's of course mostly going down.
Yeah, I mean, our
and you asked
as funding models change, are governments looking at the changing environment as well, and reacting in positive ways, or is it all like us sort of scratching our heads and wondering where it's going?
I don't really see that they're specific. That is specifically aimed at digital tools. I don't know. Jan Ole, I just saw him. Do you have any idea about that? As a Norwegian? No, I think it's. Yeah. As I see it, it's mostly touring, which is very important. That's yeah. Again, that's the way how we make money. How musicians make money. How I make my money.
Mm-hmm. Ernesto, as someone whose business it is to connect artists with audiences, through the auspices of people like us, how is the business changing, and in terms of expectations for artists, in terms of reaching, the ears that they need to get broader publicity? Are there models changing there? In my day job in marketing, we often talk about paid and earned media. How does that mix work for musicians in terms of reaching people?
I mean, in terms of how it's changing, I can say I don't really know, in that I haven't been doing it for so long. So I started my company, I say 5 years. I kind of say 5 years for everything. I've noticed lately. Like, how long has this band been together? Oh, it's about 5 years. How old's your kid? It's about 5 years. So I've been saying 5 years a lot. So I think I started my company 5 or 7 years ago. But it's so I was kind of already in a situation where, sending. I remember the first year I started, Peter was able to review probably 1 or 2 or 3 of my clients in the course of the regular, when you used to post more reviews like week to week, and I'm just singling you out because you're sitting there. Yeah. And so there were more places where you could get reviews. In the Winnipeg paper had someone that would Keith, who's still there, but they post reviews very rarely now, and a bunch across Canada where there were things. My first album got a review in the Toronto Star, and that Jeff Chapman, and that ended whatever shortly. I mean, he passed away, but he stopped doing the reviews. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I was the nail. Yeah.
Just very quickly, the issue there is that people in mainstream media, they're not hired to write about jazz. They just happen to be jazz fans who
Right.
are there, and if they retire, they're not.
Right.
They're
It's
just
no
gone.
one picks up the
They're
yeah.
like,
no one
at
carries
at
the torch.
Apex, there were 3 of us writing about jazz at the Citizen.
That's
Myself
right.
and 2 jazz fans that could really write about the music.
Yeah.
But they left the paper.
Yeah, I
on-
think
on my own.
it does come down to passionate people who are going to carry it forward. I mean, and I think, this is what
Doing other
we're all
things.
about, and I'm sure everyone in this room is about, is we're passionate about this music and keeping it going forward. And I think, it's important that we try and keep doing that and try and move with everything that's changing so that our passion doesn't kind of get left behind by the changing in the technology and everything like that. Remind me what your question was again.
Just about how you manage expectations for your artists, for your clients, and in getting connected with an audience.
So my job is to make sure that I'm able to keep up with the changing times. So I'm constantly looking for new people who are writing about music, new people who are writing about jazz specifically, obviously. There's a lot more blogs that I send stuff to rather than newspapers. Everything's changing. I'm finding the new people because as people stop, there are new people who are coming in, and I am discovering new people who are writing about music constantly because there are a lot of people still that are passionate about this music. It may not be in a paper anymore, but there's people who are writing really well thought out reviews, but on their own personal blog or on a music review website that they're sending stuff into. So I think as artists, and I think most artists understand that the likelihood that they're going to get written up in the Toronto Star is like 0. It's really not going to happen. And even to get a review in Downbeat can be really hard because when I send stuff into Downbeat, oftentimes if it's just a bunch of Canadians playing Canadian music, it really doesn't get reviewed. It's the artists that I have that have other, if there's an American guest, for example, then there's a much better chance. Or if there's a major label involved, then there's a much better chance. But independent music, it's harder to get reviewed in those major publications because, you're competing with all the jazz in the world, basically. Everyone wants a review in Downbeat, Jazz Times, Jazz Is, all of those magazines. And so I think as artists, you just have to, again, just be aware of how things are changing and always be aiming to keep up with it. And so if you can't get a review in Downbeat, but there's a guy in Peterborough, and he has a website called Textura, and he writes wonderful, really beautifully thought out, long reviews for jazz, and it's wonderful. And to be honest, I don't know how many people read the website. And I'm sure none of my clients do, and I don't think it matters because they get this beautiful review and these nice quotes. And so the fact that it doesn't come from the Toronto Star, now it doesn't matter because no one's getting jazz reviews in the Toronto Star. So it's more about you get someone writing really beautifully about your music. It almost doesn't, it's not as important where it happened as it is that it happened.
Can I
Yes.
add to that? If the guy is good, have you liked his page?
Have I?
Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, have all the musicians liked his
I
page?
make sure that I share it with
Yeah.
everyone.
It's another step,
It's-
right?
it's- it
an-
is a
that's
two-way
what-
street,
That is sort of the
absolutely.
point I was trying to
Yeah.
make, because that guy, you want that guy to get big.
Yeah.
Because he's gonna review your stuff.
Yeah.
Right? It's a very pragmatic and practical thing. The old media model was a one-way street.
Yeah.
The guy would review your stuff, and there's no relationship beyond that, right? and you were taking your chances, some reviewers are pricks.
Yeah.
They'll cut you
Yeah.
to pieces,
Yeah.
right? But if this guy is reviewing it fairly and well, he's the kind of person that should be heard by everybody
Yeah.
and read by everybody. But if people don't click on his page and say, I like this guy,
Well, and that's
he
why.
doesn't rise above to the level of downbeat or whatever, right?
Yeah, but sorry.
Sorry, I was just gonna say that's why for what we do at the publicity company, we have a social media person
Yeah.
whose job it is to every time a review comes in, she will either. I mean, ideally, what we want is we want the artist to publish it,
Oh,
so
yeah.
that all the traffic goes to the artist who got the review, and then we just share it.
Yeah, but you see,
But-
what, I'm, you
but
see
the-
what I'm saying.
Yeah,
right?
the idea is that we're constantly. I mean, it's the same with booking in clubs, right? Clubs want to make sure that you're going to do your job to help fill the club, just like they will. So, I mean, the days of getting, again coming from Toronto, to getting a week at the Montreal Bistro or at the top of the Senator, and then you just know that it's going to be full every night. I mean, that's gone. And I know if I try and get a gig in Toronto, they'll say, well, can you guarantee us 50 people in this? And I'm like, no, of course I can't. But I'll try. I'll do everything I can. I'm gonna advertise it on all the social. I'll make posters, and I'll call my family and beg them. And
At the end of the day, the currency comes back to the eyeballs and the clicks for the guy
Mhm.
in Peterborough, right?
Absolutely.
The more he has, right, the better it is for him.
yeah,
And again, the better it is for you.
and so it's always a partial.
And the Star's
partnership,
probably
yeah.
not doing any review. Reviews are funny. I mean, nobody sees. Often it's a one-night stand, so no one's going to see the show. So the newspaper's sitting there. Am I reviewing that? No one else is going to see that, right? I
Right.
mean, it's done. It's
Yeah.
gone, right? So that's one of the reasons it doesn't happen. Peter's absolutely right. The other reason it doesn't happen is there's no expertise anymore. When you go from 200 to 50, guess what's disappearing? It's the expertise. So and the time to become one. So reviews are sensitive. They're important. You have to do them properly, well, fairly. You just can't knock them off. Otherwise, it's a waste of time.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
So the effort goes into the interview, the preview, that sort of thing, and those are often more valuable for ticket sales anyway. But I do think if you find good people and they're operating on their own, and that's how they're making their living, it's the same dynamic, right? If you click on them, they'll click on you.
Yeah,
You know,
I
that's
mean, I
basically it.
routinely donate to the radio shows across Canada too, like college radio shows, because those are the people that are playing jazz.
Exactly.
So
yeah, and that's another market that's is getting hammered in
Yep.
Ontario, right?
yeah, well, yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, I'd just say, I guess, two things. One, I would completely agree with what Peter and Ernesto are saying with respect to the relationship between, the media and the subject of, that's being covered by the media. It is more of like this mutual reinforcement feedback loop thing. And I'd say that for better or for worse, because there are certain kinds of problematic issues that can come with that. Not so much conflict of interest, but something else.
Well, yeah, I mean, the one thing you need to know about the media, it's not your friend. It's more of a colleague, right, in this situation. If somebody does something wrong, I'm still going to write about it. If there's sexual harassment connected to some musician, that will be reported if you're a professional. But the nice thing about most arts reporting is they're usually talking about an idea with someone who's creating an idea, and that's an interesting and important conversation that's often lost in the discussion of the daily events of murder, in this town, the trains, the smell in the Rito station, which apparently is pretty bad. But anyway, those sorts of things drown out these conversations, but they're real. These conversations are what build a culture in a society, seems to me. So that's,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That was my next thing I was going to say. Yeah.
Can I just have like 30 seconds? Oh, just the other thing that I wanted to put out there, I guess, is the rhetorical question about what is the value of a review now? I mean, Peter has said that there is perhaps more value on previews and advanced stories about events. And at first I would say I would agree with that, and that is something that you may not need to be so much of an expert of to add. So you can seek those out more than reviews per se, because again, what is the value of the review? I had heard years ago from a guy in New York, a publicist, that everyone wants a 5-star review in Downbeat because well, maybe that's going to sell CDs, but maybe that's what you need to get like your band touring in Europe, if you can get the 5-star review in Downbeat. So now I don't know whether that aphorism is true, but what I'd say is that now I guess it's more about eyeballs and clicks and profile and crossing your fingers that there is something else out there that is going to, in the end, put money into your bank account. But if it's
So we will take questions by all means. Please just, if you don't mind, identifying yourself before you ask your question, just so we know who we're talking to, would be great. Yeah. Okay.
I'm curious to know from the artist representation side of things, the change to a more digital environment, how that's changed your approaches to presenting artists, since there's so many more people that are able to represent themselves, and like from an promoter standpoint, we're receiving so much more content from all over the place. I'm just wondering how you change your strategies to reflect that environment and cut through a lot of the chatter.
I see some black holes, but you're looking at me. No, but sorry, I didn't really get what you were saying.
Changing environment, like to a digital environment.
Yeah.
How has that changed your approach to artist representation and getting work for your artists?
How does that change? Well, it's as I said earlier, in the old days, in the very old days, that was before my time, you would write letters and make phone calls and send CDs, and the means of communication changed, and that's just the way it is. It makes my work easier, much easier, I would say, because people can listen to something very easily, and that really makes a big difference. You don't have to describe the music so much because people can click and listen. On the other hand, yeah, there's because you said there's a lot of competition too, like musicians trying to book their own gigs. I think that's always been like that, actually, and I think it's a good thing that musicians try to book their own gigs, because there's not a lot of us in this world, not a lot of agents, and a lot of musicians. So I think that's good. That for everybody it becomes easier to reach people. On the other hand, of course, promoters get tons of emails. Some of you know very well. And then it might help that they know me, they know my name, they might actually read the email I sent them. While as if some unknown musician sends something, they will never do that. So it's a two-way. It's either they know you as an agent, or they know the musicians you work with. It's also a bit of a catch-22, of course. I'm not sure if that's really changed digital post-digital era. I'm not sure.
If I could just jump in on that question and add to something that was touched on before in terms of connecting the dots between great reviews or publicity and your artists. Your artist, Firefire Orchestra, just won the Intruso poll in Portugal, based in Portugal, and published quite broadly for something like that. So you have an artist that has just won a poll, based on voting by an international cadre of critics. How do you parlay that into getting gigs for them?
Yeah, well, that's a thing that I maybe 4 times a year, just an update of touring plans, and I use that. I write about that. I put it on my Facebook page. I share it with the artists it concerns. But then I wonder who really knows what El Intruso is. What is the worth of it? It's the same as you said. There are a lot of reviews out there, a lot of end-of-year lists out, and yeah, I'm lucky enough that my artists are usually part of that. But how can I weigh that? How many people read that? What is, if you have a review in a well-known paper, then you know exactly what the status of that newspaper is. And also there's a two-way street. I don't talk directly to the audience. I talk to the presenters. I try to convince them that what I offer them is good. But then, yeah, does that mean that you get a full house? I don't know. It's not so easy. Facebook, for example, a few years ago, well, I think they still hate it. Musicians hate, the people I know, they hate Facebook. A few years ago, they refused to work with it. Now they all understand you might hate it, but you have to use it. So they do. But if you
Yeah. I mean, if I could add one comment from my own perspective, that's something that's sort of missing. We're talking about an environment here, and as we all know, this is all interconnected parts. Like, artists don't operate alone, critics don't operate alone. We're all interdependent, and it strikes me as something that's missing in this changing digital climate we're in, is that it used to be almost impossible for anyone to make the case of how many people. If Peter and I had written about somebody in the Ottawa Citizen back when we were both working there, you couldn't prove how many people read a review. I mean, the old joke about newspaper ending up under your cat the next day or your bird cage. Whereas, on a digital site like Soundstage Experience that I write for, I mean, my editor can tell you exactly how many people have read that review. And if you want to apply more analytics, like how long they spent with the review, where did they go from the review, where did they come from to get to the review? And that seems to be something we're missing in this, is that it's so much easier now to prove, you're reaching an audience and where that audience is, and then you can use those analytics to build on that audience. That seems to be part of the business model that's not coming together yet. Yeah.
I always thought that media has always been very linear. You picked up the paper on the Saturday, you went through from page 1 or from the back page. Same thing with magazines and even with television as well. But now it's all about self-directed jumping around. Everyone's going to be links and as you just mentioned, about coming from somewhere or going to somewhere. How does both media and the artist direct that particular migration of the customer, or direction of the customer? Because it's not controlled by an editor anymore. It's now where the user wants to go. So what do we do to entice the user to follow that link, or always come back, or make sure we check every month, or whatever that might be?
Peter, that sounds like one for you.
Frankly, personal opinion, trust. They need to find you and trust you, and that's, you do your best to be found. If they trust what you're giving them, and then they're actually an interested reader, in my case, right? Not a viewer or a YouTuber or whatever. If they're an interested reader and they like what's being said and they're interested in the ideas, then they come back. But it is, I don't know what level of hell Sisyphus was in, but it is a bit like that, eh? You're rolling this rock up the hill all the time. It's a very shallow rise, but earn. And in the old days, it was, you're right, it was from the media to the receiver. And they would sit and grumble and say, oh my God, well, they got that wrong. And every now and again, somebody'd write a letter. Usually it was, I can't remember his name, but anyway, Charlie, yeah, there was one guy named Charles King, who's a former editor at the Citizen, then he became a cranky old man at the Citizen past his time. But those sorts of people would send you letters, and you'd just, you gotta listen now, right? You gotta have, that is what has really changed in the media. It is now a democratized world. Problem is, it's a very cluttered world, and it's often very narrow casted, right? I mean, it's like, people who like Bulgarian flute music and they're right on it, right? And it's that kind of a thing. You need to be in that kind of mind space. But ultimately, it's trust. People are lied to a lot, right?
Yeah, Gavin McClintock, I pick up on a couple of those points. It seems to me that what we've got is a very fractured
experience in the newspaper business, it was always like that. You know, that's why what so-called pyramid writing style was invented. So you have all the information in the first paragraph, realizing that Buddy's probably just going to move on to the cat ad at the back, right? We called them scanners. They're still scanning. They're still looking for stuff. You know, you'll get 5% of people who click on your headline, maybe reading it. But that's 5% you didn't have the day before. You know, it's kind of ephemeral. It's kind of like guesswork, and that's why I talk about trust as something that builds up over time. Maybe they read the second paragraph the next time out. You know, maybe I'm interested in that, and they stick with it a little bit. But New Yorker magazine still does pretty darn well.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, one of the more optimistic things that I saw when I was blogging more about jazz than I blogged, you know, pretty extensively, I guess, from about 2008 till, let's say 2018, let's trail off, is that for those people that found me, the longer I wrote and the nerdier I wrote, like, the more clicks I got. So it's this oddly counterintuitive thing that it wasn't scammers, it was actually like passionate enthusiasts, and they appreciated the stuff that went indie. And we actually do still see that somehow at the newspaper. I wrote a 2,000-word piece on the weekend that garnered, shared 200 times and got 500 comments, and it was like long, much longer than other things. But so it is still possible. That's at least one sort of hopeful thing I can leave you with.
Might have time for one more question. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question probably have another whole panel discussion on, but it's about live music. We don't really talk about that very much on the panel. So what is the end user? When Peter talks about doing a review, it's always about the CD, and buying the CD. But who buys the CD and then becomes a bum in the seats of a live event, which is what we do, most of us. I'm Chaz Sudbury, I'm Hale, Chaz Sudbury. So my job is to get the bumps in the seats, but the live music, how do we do that?
Well, we're hopefully going to answer. that was a great segue. Thanks so much.
Stick around.
But I guess my point is, it's not these two little things in your system, right? For those of us that are a little bit older, and when they thought that vinyl was going to come again, I thought, this is going to be great, because this is going to be good for live music. Because when you had an LP, that was something that, was tangible, and usually you went to an event, a live thing. Anyway, that's another.
I mean, I don't think anybody has any stats that I know of to connect it to the live audience. But I will say that I just saw some stats from SoundScan that for the first time since the mid '80s, LPs have outsold CDs again.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I don't know. As I said, I don't know if that how that's connecting to audience figures. I don't know, Danielle, if you have any kind of stats you've seen in terms of audience numbers. I think we're just, we're going to be anecdotal on that, maybe, but certainly in the next panel, hopefully we can talk about, if not where we are, how we get to. We can talk about, if not where we are, how we get to where we want to be in terms of building teams.
I think the trick with live audiences is that I think it's YouTube that has really made that a tough thing, because again, like talking about my students, they're watching stuff all the time on YouTube, so they can see, or they can go and watch what's happening at Smalls in New York City tonight live. So the impetus to actually leave their house and pay money, it's just not as strong anymore. Now, I think the difference is when they actually do it, they realize how valuable it is, and hopefully that has a lasting impact, because then you can actually see the musicians in person, experience it, and meet them, and be part of that audience thing, that when you're in an audience, you're watching a really great show and you all share in this incredible moment. But I feel like the younger generations don't all know about it quite yet. And so I feel like if I can speak as a parent now, because I have 2 young kids, I feel like that's also important for us as you know, as parents, is to make sure that younger people are going to see live music all the time, and understanding that watching it on YouTube it's a thing, and it's a really cool tool, but that's all it is. I hate watching stuff on YouTube, but it's because I get nothing out of it. I want to go see a show. I don't want to watch a live show on YouTube.
But I'm not so pessimistic though. I mean, I don't have any stats or anything, but just by talking to people and by going to concerts myself, I think it's people go. People wanna hear music. They want to see live music. Also, young people.
Yeah, well, because it's so much more powerful to
Yeah.
actually do.
And I think anybody among us, and most of us have, including some of you in the audience, if you've gone to the Winter Jazz Festival in New York City, it's, not to mention the Winter Jazz Festival here, it's, you know, people are turning out. It's always encouraging, you know, when I go to Winter Jazz in New York, to see not just the numbers, but the young people, and people just like really jacked up about the music, like really excited about what they're seeing and what they're going to see, and the word of mouth, you know, conversations that you have afterwards are astounding. I'm sure Peter Kankura can attest to that. You know, he's hung out there with me, so you know, it's great. So, you know, I'm encouraged that way.
Yeah, and I think anybody among us, and most of us have, including some of you in the audience, if you've gone to the Winter Jazz Festival in New York City, it's, not to mention the Winter Jazz Festival here, it's, you know, people are turning out. It's always encouraging, you know, when I go to Winter Jazz in New York, to see not just the numbers, but the young people, and people just like really jacked up about the music, like really excited about what they're seeing and what they're going to see, and the word of mouth, you know, the conversations that you have afterwards are astounding. I'm sure Peter Kankura can attest to that. You know, he's hung out there with me, so you know, it's great. So, you know, I'm encouraged that way. Anyway, I want to thank all you for your attention, and please, our panel. Thanks.